What happens when you take two locomotives too old for service, paint them up like prize fighters, set them on the same track, and invite 25,000 Texans to watch the result? You get a one-day city named Crush, a roar of iron, an explosion so powerful it turned a picnic into pandemonium. Some went home limping, some went home bragging, and all went home certain they had witnessed history's loudest bad idea. Act 1. The Grand Idea. If you want to understand the human heart, start with a timetable. Nothing reveals the aspirations of a species quite like its insistence on when things will arrive, particularly those made of iron, fire, and optimism. In the last part of the 19th century, America believed in trains with a faith other civilizations reserved for miracles, and Texas believed in them with a kind of cheerful bigness that preferred proof in decibels. A locomotive was not merely a machine. It was a declaration that the map should stop arguing and lie flat. It was also, as some discovered, a very fast way to deliver a moral lesson to a large audience. But I am getting ahead of myself, which is the custom of historians when the ending is too good to resist. The story begins with a man named William George Crush, whose name sounds suspiciously like a prophecy, and, to his credit, he tried to live up to it. Mr. Crush was an executive of the Missouri, Kansas, Texas Railroad, the Katy for short and for romance, and he had a problem that would warm the heart of any ambitious American. Too many older locomotives, not enough patience, and a public perpetually thirsty for entertainment. The company had shiny new engines to show off, and the old ones were sulking in sidings like retired prize fighters. Accounting is a respectable profession, but it rarely sells tickets. Spectacle, on the other hand, will persuade even the thriftiest soul to part with a nickel, especially if there's a rumor someone else might part with a tooth. Now, in those days, people would gather by the thousands to watch nearly anything with sufficient promise of calamity. Balloon ascensions, cycloramas, volcanic lectures, and debates about bimetallism. There was a traveling instinct in the public mind, a feeling that the frontier had been folded up like a pocket knife, and excitement needed a new pasture. It is a known fact of human nature that when the future slows down, the people will attempt to accelerate it by colliding two portions of the present. Mr. Crush understood this. He looked at his stack of obsolete locomotives, their boilers still proud, but their gears already yesterday's fashion, and he had an epiphany. If one train is interesting, two trains must be twice as interesting. If one train going somewhere is progress, two trains going at each other is destiny. And if you can't squeeze more life out of the machine, you can still squeeze an admission fee out of its death. What he proposed was simple enough to be considered genius, and genius enough to be considered a bad idea. Build a temporary town for a single day, lay down a stretch of track, set two venerable locomotives nose to nose at a great distance, open the throttles, and let them argue about right-of-way. Invite the public. Invite everyone. Announce that the Katy will provide special excursion trains to carry spectators to the site. Post broadside notices until the cattle grow tired of being asked to move aside for another poster. Make it a picnic, a fair, a jubilee, a once-in-a-lifetime lesson in physics as taught by showmen. Name the place Crush, because if you're going to tempt fate, you might as well send her a calling card. You might think the idea would encounter resistance among serious gentlemen who wear waistcoats with watch chains, and you would be right, except for the arithmetic. The arithmetic was irresistible. Imagine the ticket receipts, the lemonade vendors, the vendors who promised lemonade but sold courage, the photographers, the souvenir hawkers, the rail fares to and from the appointed field. Every one of those little dimes marching dutifully toward the company's ledgers. Nothing will persuade a board of directors to grow philosophical faster than an evidence-based forecast of profit. And besides, they reasoned, what harm could there be? Locomotives collide all the time out of sheer misunderstanding. Surely one could collide deliberately, with forethought, prayer, and a few ropes to keep the public at a safe distance. Texas embraced the notion with the same calm rationality it applies to thunderstorms and chili recipes. By September of 1896, when the event was set to take place, the populace had sharpened its appetite. Word spread town to town on the rails themselves, for gossip enjoys a good roadbed. Farmers read about it in their papers and discovered the plow was suddenly less persuasive than a promise of noise. Schoolmasters found the day's arithmetic compromised by the subject's application to flying boilers. Whole families packed baskets with fried chicken, deviled eggs, pie, biscuits, and a level of optimism that can only be described as hereditary. Young men planned their courtship with the confidence that nothing says, "I am a man of steady character," quite like standing next to someone when history breaks something. The temporary town rose from a Texas pasture like a mirage built by carpenters. There were tents for refreshments and tents for photographers and tents for the kind of enterprise that prefers not to be cataloged. A grandstand appeared because America never stages a folly without providing a seat for it. The railroad laid track with the casual speed of a nation used to drawing straight lines through reluctant geographies. At one end of the rails waited an elderly locomotive daubed in a dignified number and a fresh coat of hope. At the other, her counterpart nursed the same mixture of pride and terminal destiny. They were promised to one another like participants in a wedding written by a lawyer. Now, I will confess a personal weakness. I like a good announcement. The literature of the event, handbills, notices, breathless editorials, had a tone of theological certainty. The trains would start. The trains would meet. The trains would cease to be, in a manner both educational and satisfying. There would be a crash, yes, but not a messy one. More of a gentleman's disagreement resolved with a shrug. Boilers would not explode, because boilers were made by men who belonged to lodges, and such men would never allow their handiwork to behave impolitely in company. The passengers, that is to say, the witnesses, would stand an approved distance, which is the exact number of feet at which danger develops scruples. The company engineers performed calculations with slide rules and squared paper, smoking their pipes in the authoritative way that has launched many a catastrophe with impeccable posture. Some folks attended out of pure curiosity, others because the price of admission included a holiday, and still others because a person likes to be present when the universe pronounces a verdict. Consider the varieties of observer who materialized at the edges of that pasture. There was the fellow who understood everything about steam, standing with his arms crossed and his jaw set, prepared to nod when the inevitable occurred. There was the wife who had brought a parasol and the conviction that her husband's appetite for spectacle would be rewarded with a sermon later. There were boys who measured their courage by how close they could stand to the fence, and infants who slept through everything because they were still new to human errors and required rest. There were newspapermen rehearsing adjectives under their breath like prayers, and preachers rehearsing the same adjectives for later use in sermons. And there were the merchants who looked at the crowd and saw an ecosystem with cash. Mr. Crush, the architect of this little apocalypse, moved about the scene with the briskness of a man who has hired a day of destiny and hopes it will show up on time. He had solved innumerable problems already: the water supply, the sanitation, the timetables for the excursion trains, the matter of fencing off the track so that the crowd's curiosity would have to clamber over its own better judgment to get closer. He had even engaged lawmen to give the affair a stern countenance, because nothing says safe like a badge that knows your uncle. He must have suspected that he was riding a very large animal whose temperament remains unknown. But he also had the comfort of numbers. The company had employed experts, each with a pencil and certainty. They had calculated the distance, the speed, the moment of impact, and the ultimate rest of the wreckage, which would be dramatic but civilized, two qualities that rarely meet except by appointment. The nearer the day came, the more the event swelled beyond its framework, like a story that keeps finding new details in its pockets. Towns along the Katy line emptied like pews at the benediction. Children learned a new vocabulary: trestle, throttle, torque, and souvenir. Vendors devised strategies for supplying the thirst of 10,000 throats with liquids of varied honesty. Photographers set up their tripods with the solemnity of surgeons, mindful that it is hard to coax a camera to anticipate a moment it has never seen before. A brass band warmed up with tunes that had the agreeable quality of sounding better from a distance. The Sun, which owns the patent on Texas, conducted preliminary inspections of every scalp in attendance. There's a special pitch of anticipation that can only be reached when a crowd feels it has become a single organism. People arrived and felt their opinions upgrade themselves by the power of multiplication. A man who alone would have called the enterprise foolish found himself in company declaring a genius, while a woman who would ordinarily disdain such nonsense discovered a patriotic appetite for spectacle. The air quivered with the mathematics of a thing. 2 locomotives, 2 great boilers, 2 lines of rivets proud as cathedral stitches, 2 plumes of steam like heraldic feathers, all moving toward a single point, as though the whole contraption of the century wished to plant a flag on the exact spot where sense stops and story begins. Let's say a word about trains, since we must. A locomotive is a paradox on wheels. It is a conqueror that drinks water. It is a furnace taught to behave. It is a blacksmith's idea of a thoroughbred. The engine breathes, whistles, pants, and shouts. It speaks in pound-feet and conclusions. It has the moral character of a mule with a schedule. Once it starts, you may as well shout advice to a comet. The engineers of the Katy knew all this, of course, the way a rancher knows the personality of his more opinionated bulls. They greased every bearing, checked every valve, polished the brass until it fainted from compliments, and told themselves, with the serene optimism of specialists, that they had accounted for everything. Specialists always say this. Is there lullaby? Even so, there were whispers. It is impossible to gather a multitude for the purpose of watching a collision without someone clearing his throat and recalling the behavior of boilers when they resent their circumstances. Some veteran of the rails mentioned, here and there, that steam under pressure is a negotiator with limited patience, and that fragments of iron possess a notable unwillingness to remain where they are placed after an explosion. But these remarks were drowned beneath the brass band, and the brass band was drowned beneath the dime novel unfolding in every mind. We have come to see the century's mightiest toy meet itself at speed, and we will go home with a tale. Any enterprise that must compete with that sentence is already shouting across a canyon. Mr. Crush chose the field with care. It lay near Waco, accessible yet out of everyone's way, the sort of meadow that could host a festival without filing a complaint. There were hills for viewing and level ground for commerce. The pop-up town gained streets without addresses, landmarks without names. There was the lemonade tent, the ice cream booth, the place where a magician failed to levitate, but did extract coins from the pockets of men who swore they had none. There was a preacher who declared he was not there to judge, but had brought along judgment, just in case. There were gambling men who looked at the engines and wished for odds on every component. And there were mothers, practical and shrewd, who took one look at the wire fence and thought to themselves, that is not enough fence. The locomotives themselves, those aging sovereigns, received fresh paint as though vanity could sweeten their fate. One wore a coat of bright color, the other a rival livery. They looked like carnival prize fights disguised as metallurgy. Their tenders were loaded with cordwood and coal, their whistles rehearsed, their throttles introduced to the notion of dramatic purpose. There were numbers on the company charter, but they were also personalities. The left-hand engine seemed the type to arrive early and think less of those who did not. The right-hand engine possessed the truculence of a bull asked to share a pen. If you think this is unscientific, I will remind you that once a machine becomes the focus of 10,000 opinions, it has acquired a soul by popular vote. The papers had taken to calling it a spectacular collision, a phrase that wears its hat on one word and its boots on the other. Spectacle prefers its disasters to be well-mannered. There was a confidence in the language that would make a prudent man search for a cellar. The company published rules. The crowd must remain behind the rope. No one may approach the track. The engineers will set the throttles and dismount before the engines gather speed. It was all very methodical, very American, very much the way we invite risk to dinner and give it a place card at the table. A few free thinkers wrote letters to editors suggesting that when two locomotives embrace at speed, their boilers may express strong opinions. These letters were filed under yet a section not widely read. On the morning appointed, the excursion trains began to deliver their cargoes of mirth. People stepped down onto the prairie and blinked, as if they had emerged from a tunnel into a bright future. There was a smell of dust and peppered sausage and mechanical holiness. The two engines stood far apart, their pilots pointed like arguments. In the middle distance, the track shimmered with heat, drawing a silver line from impatience to inevitability. Folks milled and laughed and consulted the sun for the hour. A boy with a slingshot discovered he had left it at home and felt this omission would be mentioned later in his memoirs. A grandfather explained to anybody within the range of his voice that he had seen something similar during the war, though he could not quite recall which war or which something. The orators, for every crowd breeds its orators like mushrooms after rain, took to independent stumps. One declared the event a testament to progress. We have conquered distance so effectively that we must now destroy it for entertainment. Another announced that this was a moral parable, though he would need to see the debris to identify the moral. A third proclaimed that America, being young, still believed in the educational value of a good bang. These speeches were not official, but they enjoyed the advantage of being as correct as any official statement could afford to be on a day devoted to certainty's undoing. I have always thought the strangest thing about a spectacle is how ordinary the minutes feel right before it ceases to be ordinary. There's a flocking of attention, a tightening of focus, but the world goes on being itself. A breeze asks permission of the grass. A hat tumbles and is rescued by a gentleman suddenly promoted to hero. A child discovers that the earth is made of many kinds of dirt and endeavors to sample them all. A vendor advertises a tonic for nerves, which is chiefly nerves in a bottle. Meanwhile, the engines wait, affecting nonchalance like two duelists who have agreed to let physics do the shooting. As the hour approached, Mr. Crush arranged himself at a spot that would be remembered, which is the first duty of any impresario. The band found a piece of music suited to a moment that would obliterate the need for music. The engineers climbed into their cabs and performed those rites that have dignified railroading since the first kettle learned to run. They adjusted valves, checked gauges, consulted the pressure, and examined the track ahead as though it might express second thoughts. When all was in readiness, the plan called for them to open the throttles to a predetermined notch, set the engines on their path, and dismount with that precise combination of briskness and dignity which tells a crowd that everything has been accounted for. There's an art to leaving a machine in charge of itself. Some call it courage. Others, who are more familiar with machines, call it faith with a generous expense account. But that is the threshold, and we're not to cross it yet, for this is only the first act, and first acts are for beginnings. It is enough, for now, to stand with the multitude and feel the ground observe us. We are in a Texas field temporarily named after a man whose idea has been promoted to geography. The sun is making its customary arguments. The locomotives are poised like two paragraphs in a sentence that will not end politely. Children are being told to mind the rope as though the rope were a moral boundary. And every soul present is wondering, in his or her private arithmetic, how close one may stand to an event and still be safely somewhere else. Let us leave them there for the moment. The engines with their breath held, the crowd with its jokes rehearsed, the promoters with their sums balanced like a chair on two legs, and remind ourselves of the principle that underlies the enterprise. The 19th century adored a demonstration. It built domes to house its confidence and tent shows to discharge it. It loved the sound of complicated words and the smell of hot metal. Its science was precise, its memory selective, and its appetite for proof nearly as large as its appetite for roast beef. If the century could teach only one lesson, it would be that certainty is an excellent opening bid. In a minute, the whistles will announce themselves as if the sky were taking attendance. In a minute, the throttles will be set, and the engineers will step down to listen to their handiwork traveling away from them like a grown child. In a minute, 10,000 hearts will agree to beat to the same measure, while two iron ones beat to a different one. But that minute belongs to the next act. For now, fix in your mind the picture. A man named Crush lending his name to a town that did not exist yesterday and would not exist tomorrow. Two dignified relics of progress polishing their manners for a final introduction. A multitude composed of towns, families, opinions, and appetites, and a hot September sky ready to witness a thesis on the subject of human ingenuity and its unadvertised side effects. If you have ever felt that history is a clever child who whispers, "Watch this," and then runs, you already understand why so many people came. They wished to be present when the century waved its hat and attempted a trick. They did not yet know what sort of trick it would be, but they trusted it to be loud, and they were not wrong. Act 2. The Great Day. Morning arrived at Crush, Texas, with a brightness that suggested the sun had been bribed to serve as spotlight. By 9 o'clock, excursion trains were already delivering cargoes of humanity, each car stacked with farmers, townsfolk, school teachers, salesmen, babies, and more fried chicken than a sensible pasture had ever entertained. Dust rose from the meadow until it formed a second horizon. By 10, the temporary city swelled with tents, banners, lemonade stands, sausage vendors, photographers, card sharps, evangelists, and the unmistakable aroma of commerce. It was a fairground wearing the borrowed jacket of destiny. The crowd eventually reached numbers that defied the arithmetic of fences. 25,000 souls, give or take a sermon, spread themselves across the hills and hollows, each certain of occupying the best vantage point, though all were equally removed from safety. There was laughter, bargaining, fiddling, and no shortage of oratory from men who believed history had sent them invitations to deliver their thoughts. The trains themselves sat on the far ends of the track, looking patient in the way a pair of bulls look patient before someone removes the fence. Vendors shouted the virtues of their wares: lemonade that tasted faintly of tin pail, popcorn brave enough to crack a molar, sausages seasoned with optimism. A brass band tootled away with stars and stripes forever, proving that nothing says patriotism like a Sousa march before an impending calamity. Children darted between skirts and boots, waving penny flags and demanding candy. Preachers raised their hands and declared the whole affair a parable of man's folly, which improved business at the sausage tent considerably. Everyone agreed that never before had so many people gathered in one place with such cheerful intent to watch two objects cease to exist. The locomotives were celebrities now. One was painted a proud green, the other a noble red, like prize-fighters dressed for the occasion. They had been polished until their brass fittings could blind a man at 40 paces. The crowd treated them like royalty. Photographs snapped. Ladies in parasols pointed approvingly. Boys measured their worth by how loudly they could cheer for their train. Each engine had its faction, and arguments about superiority filled the air with more heat than the Texas sun. By noon, the spectacle was officially in session. William George Crush himself, a man now so large in reputation that his mustache required its own introduction, took his place before the multitude. He announced that the crash would occur at precisely 5 o'clock. 5 hours of anticipation stretched before the crowd, hours in which vendors grew wealthy, gamblers grew louder, and children grew filthy beyond the power of soap. People occupied themselves with guessing games. Would the boilers explode? Would the engines rear up like startled horses? Would the debris fly far enough to justify a thrilling story told later at the expense of honesty? Engineers fussed over the locomotives like nervous fathers at a wedding. They stoked the boilers, checked the gauges, and tested the whistles, each shriek sending shivers through the crowd. Photographers positioned themselves, squinting through lenses that had never before attempted to capture history, moving at 40 miles an hour. A few journalists rehearsed their adjectives, trying to decide whether magnificent would outshine colossal, or if unprecedented might upstage them both. As afternoon wore on, the air thickened with expectancy. The crowd became a single breathing creature, restless and humming. Men passed flasks in the shade, women fanned themselves with programs, and children climbed shoulders to see over the sea of hats. Vendors grew hoarse, shouting their offers. Gamblers argued over wagers, and preachers muttered prayers that sounded suspiciously like bets hedged with heaven. At last, the hour struck. The band fell silent. The crowd surged forward until the ropes bowed with the pressure of curiosity. The engineers mounted their engines one final time, their faces calm in the manner of men who had practiced looking calm. They opened the throttles, set the levers, and with quick steps dismounted to the cheers of the multitude. The two locomotives hissed, snorted, and began to move. Slowly at first, like reluctant giants stretching their legs, then faster, their wheels clattering against the rails with increasing confidence. The whistles screamed like heralds at a medieval joust, and the crowd responded with a roar that shook the dust from the hills. On they came, smoke plumes trailing like banners, headlamps glaring at one another as if locked in a duel of stairs. The ground vibrated. Children clung to skirts, men clenched fists, women pressed hands to their lips. 40 miles an hour, then 50, faster than most had ever traveled in their lives. The space between them narrowed with terrifying certainty. And then, impact. The sound was like the sky breaking a promise. Iron met iron with a crash so tremendous it startled birds in neighboring counties. The two engines reared against each other, their smokestacks tilting like wrestlers in embrace. And for a moment, it seemed they might simply lock together in a dignified stalemate. The crowd cheered, relieved that the company's calculations had proven correct. Then the boilers objected. With a thunderclap, both engines exploded. Shards of iron whistled through the air like malevolent pigeons. Wheels, pistons, and chunks of steel described parabolas worthy of Euclid. Plumes of steam enveloped the wreck, while debris rained upon the astonished multitude. A man lost his hat to a flying bolt. Another found himself the sudden owner of a steel fragment where his picnic basket had been. The cheering stopped. The silence that followed was not reverence, but the sort of silence one hears when people are too surprised to remember their vocabularies. Then came the cries, not of joy, but of injury. Several were struck by flying debris, some gravely. A photographer, brave or foolish enough to be near the front, was flung senseless by the blast. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Fathers attempted to look dignified while ducking, and vendors declared sudden clearance sales on whatever had not been knocked from their shelves. In the center, where the two locomotives had been, there remained only a smoking ruin, a grotesque sculpture of mangled steel, shattered wood, and hubris rendered three-dimensional. The brass fittings, once polished for glory, lay twisted like tin toys. Steam rose like incense at a funeral. The crowd, stunned, began to murmur. Some cursed the company, others marveled at the spectacle, and more than a few declared it the finest entertainment they had ever witnessed, injuries notwithstanding. Human nature, when confronted with catastrophe, often divides itself into lawsuits and anecdotes. Both were already forming. As evening fell, the band resumed playing because bands, like history, are obliged to continue no matter what has exploded. The crowd began to disperse, many limping, some nursing wounds, all carrying stories. They would return to towns and farms with tales that grew taller at each retelling. Wheels the size of houses flying overhead, steam clouds blotting out the sun, a crash that rattled teeth in Mexico. Mr. Crush, for his part, maintained an expression suitable to a man whose name had just become an accidental pawn. He apologized with the solemnity of one who has seen arithmetic betrayed by physics. The company, embarrassed but still breathing profit, quickly dismissed him, then just as quickly reinstated him. For railroads, like nations, cannot remain angry at successful spectacles, no matter how explosive. The great crash at Crush was over, but the story had only begun. Act 3. The Aftermath and Legacy. The morning after the crash at Crush, the Texas sun rose with its usual lack of sentiment, pouring light upon a scene that looked less like yesterday's carnival and more like the remains of a blacksmith's bad dream. The field was littered with fragments of iron, scorched timber, and the kind of souvenirs nobody had intended to sell. Where once 2 locomotives had stood proud and polished, there now sat a twisted monument to human optimism, wrapped in a lingering perfume of smoke and singed sausage. The crowd, or what was left of it, limped away with tales already improving in transit. Those who had stood far back announced that they had been near the front. Those who had been near the front declared that they had survived by clever maneuvering, and those who had actually been hit were too busy looking for a doctor to offer their testimony. In every direction, stories sprouted like weeds after a rain. The crash was described as louder, faster, brighter, deadlier, and altogether grander than it had been, which is saying something, for it had been grand enough to cause lawyers to sharpen pencils before they even returned home. Injuries, alas, were plentiful. Several spectators carried away bruises, cuts, or worse. At least 2 people died, proof that while trains can be persuaded to meet on schedule, debris keeps its own calendar. A young man, struck by flying iron, succumbed later to his wounds, becoming the unwilling martyr of curiosity. Another lost an eye, though in the retelling he would later insist he had given it freely to science. The photographers fared no better. One was knocked senseless, his camera reduced to an assortment of regrettable parts, though rumor insists the last image he captured was that of the explosion itself, preserved on glass like a judgment from Olympus. And yet, despite tragedy, there was no riot. Texans, being practical, accepted that when you attend an advertised train collision, you ought to expect the trains to follow through with enthusiasm. Many went home still satisfied they had received their money's worth, injuries included. Some even scavenged the wreckage, pocketing hunks of twisted iron as keepsakes. To this day, pieces of locomotive from Crush are said to occupy mantelpieces and tool sheds across Texas, mute testimony to a day when entertainment flew through the air at considerable velocity. The company, however, faced an awkward problem. A spectacle meant to glorify the Katy Railroad had turned into a public relations nightmare, complete with casualties. The directors fired William George Crush before the embers cooled, only to reinstate him the next day when they realized that his event, though disastrous, had succeeded in drawing the largest crowd ever assembled in Texas. Besides, railroads were in the business of publicity, and bad publicity still traveled on rails. Crush would remain employed by the Katy for the rest of his life, though he probably never again suggested using locomotives as entertainment devices. Newspapers, meanwhile, devoured the story with relish. Headlines shouted of catastrophe and folly, while editorials debated whether mankind's appetite for spectacle had finally exceeded its portion. Some papers blamed the company's engineers for miscalculating the stability of boilers. Others declared the accident an act of providence, a reminder that steam should be respected, if not feared. One particularly poetic journalist described the scene as a grand ballet of destruction, choreographed by hubris, with iron for dancers and physics for orchestra. It is difficult to compete with that sentence, so most papers did not try. Not everyone was dismayed. Scott Joplin, the ragtime composer, even wrote a piece called The Great Crush Collision March. It was performed with a peculiar mixture of triumph and irony, proof that if you give Americans a disaster, they will put it in 2/4 time and sell sheet music. Some claim Joplin had attended the event himself, though evidence is thin. What is certain is that he saw in it the perfect material for a syncopated commentary. Lively, ridiculous, and distinctly American. The march was published, and though it did not become a standard, it stands as the only known musical composition dedicated to the destruction of locomotives for sport. As the years passed, the crash at Crush drifted into legend. Folks who had not been there swore they had, and those who had been there could scarcely believe it themselves. It was remembered at family gatherings, told in barber chairs, retold in saloons, embroidered in every direction until the original event disappeared beneath layers of exaggeration. Some swore that wheels had flown a mile, others that the explosion had shaken crockery in Waco. Children grew up hearing the tale until it seemed less like history and more like folklore, a Texas cousin to Paul Bunyan or Pecos Bill, except with more lawyers. The site itself vanished. The temporary town of Crush dissolved the day after the collision. Its tents folded, its grandstand dismantled, its saloons hauled away. Nothing remained but scorched grass and a few stubborn bolts too deeply buried to bother with. The land returned to being a pasture, though one suspects the cows treated it with suspicion for some time afterward. Today, no marker stands to indicate where 25,000 people once gathered to witness the strangest picnic in railroad history. Yet the legacy endures. The crash at Crush has become shorthand for any grand plan carried out with confidence, calculation, and catastrophic results. Politicians invoke it when their projects explode. Writers borrow it when describing the peculiar marriage of human ingenuity and human folly. Teachers tell it to students as a parable, that progress without prudence may end in smoke, and that people will still come in droves if you promise them a crash. If there is a moral, and Texans always suspect there is one, somewhere between the sausage tent and the brass band, it is that mankind's appetite for spectacle is bottomless, and our ability to forgive a good disaster is boundless. For though people were hurt, and though property was destroyed, the crowd still declared it the most remarkable day of their lives. They had seen history run at each other from opposite ends of a track, and they went home with stories that lasted longer than the bruises. And William George Crush? He lived quietly afterward, his name forever attached to the event. Few men have the honor of founding a city for a single day, watching it vanish the next, and then spending the rest of their lives explaining themselves. He did not become rich, nor did he become infamous, but he did become a footnote in American history, which is often more enduring than either wealth or notoriety. After all, how many of us can claim we threw a party so large it exploded? The crash at Crush remains a monument, not in stone or bronze, but in anecdote and chuckle. It is remembered not with solemnity, but with the kind of affectionate disbelief reserved for uncles who attempt to fix plumbing with dynamite. It proves that America, in its youth, was willing to collide progress against itself just to see what happened. And what happened was unforgettable. Epilogue, memory, folklore, and human nature. History, when it is finished with its official duties of treaties, wars, and election returns, likes to amuse itself by keeping a few sideshows alive. The crash at Crush is one of those amusements, a story too odd to be forgotten, too pointless to be ignored, and too entertaining to be left to the specialists. It endures because it is the kind of tale that can be told around a campfire, in a classroom, or at a dinner table, each version slightly embroidered until the truth is wearing a new hat. In the years that followed, the event settled into that most durable category, legend flavor with laughter. People who were there swore the crash shook the ground like an earthquake. Those who were not swore the debris blotted out the sun. By the 1920s, it was already a yarn, told with grins and incredulous shakes of the head. By the 1950s, it had matured into folklore. The kind of story you repeat not because you need to know it, but because you enjoy watching someone else try to believe it. Texans, of course, kept it closest. In a state where tall tales are grown like cotton, The crash at Crush fit neatly alongside the oil gusher, the cattle drive, and the thunderstorm that floods one side of a street while the other stays dry. To say, "I was there," became a small badge of honor, like claiming acquaintance with a famous outlaw or surviving a tornado without spilling your coffee. Whole families insisted their ancestors had attended, even when census records placed those ancestors in another county altogether. History is flexible when pride requires it. Even outside Texas, the story had legs. It was retold in railroading circles, where old engineers would chuckle and wag their pipes, shaking their heads at the foolishness of allowing boilers to decide the matter. It appeared in books about odd Americana, sandwiched between accounts of two-headed calves and municipal parades featuring the longest cigar ever rolled. The story had that elusive quality writers adore. It was absurd, but it was true. And what its lesson? Well, every age draws its own. The moralists declare it a warning against reckless spectacle. The engineers frame it as a case study in pressure and error. The humorists embrace it as proof that mankind will always prefer a crash to a lecture. And ordinary folks with no philosophy at all keep it alive simply because it makes for a good yarn. And a good yarn is rarer than a locomotive willing to sacrifice itself for ticket sales. Perhaps that is the greatest irony. The crash at Crush, meant as a single day's diversion, has outlived the locomotives, the company men, the newspapers, and even the pasture itself. The town of Crush vanished by nightfall, yet the story of what happened there remains. No permanent city was ever built on that ground, but in memory, Crush is as lasting as Boston, Chicago, or Dallas. A city of one day, whose population has only grown with each retelling. And it endures not because it was noble, but because it was ridiculous. Human beings will forgive much in the name of laughter, and more still in the name of wonder. The crash at Crush was both. A wonder so astonishing it could only be absurd, and an absurdity so grand it could only be wonderful. So, the next time someone insists that history is nothing but dates and battles, you may politely correct them. Tell them that once, in Texas, a railroad built a town for a single day, invited 25,000 people to a pasture, painted 2 locomotives like gladiators, and crashed them headlong for sport. Tell them the crowd cheered, the boilers exploded, the lawsuits followed, and a ragtime march was written in its honor. And tell them that, somehow, the man responsible kept his job. That is history, too. The history that sneaks out the back door of seriousness, dresses itself in irony, and survives because it makes us smile. The crash at Crush is a reminder that mankind, with all its inventions and ambitions, still finds time to gather in a field and watch 2 machines collide, simply because it seemed like a fine idea at the time. And maybe it was. For in the end, history is not only the tale of our triumphs, but also the echo of our follies. Follies so grand, so wholehearted, and so sincerely executed that they become immortal. The crash at Crush was one of those. And as long as people delight in telling stories that end with the words, "You won't believe it, but it really happened," the ghost of that September day in 1896 will continue to rattle down the tracks. I really hope you liked this totally bonkers piece of history. I have actually never heard about this story before I accidentally stumbled over it just recently and decided that I must make this into a video. Please give a comment, click the like button, and subscribe.